The morning light fell upon Persepolis in angles that transformed stone into gold, the terraces of the great platform catching the first rays of a sun that rose over mountains whose peaks held snow, even when summer burned across the plains below. Columns carved with precision that lesser civilizations could not comprehend stood in rows whose rhythm created music for the eyes, their surfaces bearing images of guardians and tribute bearers, lions and lotuses, the endless procession of an empire's majesty frozen in eternal stone. Attendants moved through halls whose scale announced power beyond ordinary imagination, their soft footsteps absorbed by spaces designed to humble visitors with the might they represented. The Achaemenid Empire stretched across horizons that no single mind could fully encompass, its territories extending from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea, from the steppes where nomads wandered to the cataracts of the Nile, where ancient monuments recalled civilizations already old when Persia was young. 20 satrapies administered populations, speaking dozens of languages, worshipping countless gods, practicing customs that varied as widely as the landscapes that contained them. This was the empire of empires, the kingdom of kingdoms, the inheritance that awaited whichever son of Darius the Great could claim it when the time came for succession. Into this world of immeasurable power and profound complexity, a prince was born around 518 BC, whose name would echo through centuries in languages that his own people never spoke. The child received a name that announced the destiny his parents intended. Kushayasha, in the tongue of his ancestors, rendered as Xerxes by the Greeks, whose histories would preserve his memory long after Persian records had crumbled. The name meant ruling over heroes, a title that the boy who bore it would spend his life attempting to deserve. His father Darius had risen to the throne through circumstances that made his son's legitimacy a matter requiring careful construction. The great king had not inherited power through the straightforward succession that older dynasties transmitted automatically, but had seized it after the chaos following Cyrus the Great's son Cambyses, claiming to have killed a usurper who had falsely presented himself as Cyrus's younger son. The story that justified Darius's rule required reinforcement through connections that his own bloodline could not provide, and nothing served this purpose better than marriage to the daughter of Empire's founder. Atossa became Darius's queen and Xerxes's mother, her importance deriving from blood that flowed directly from Cyrus himself. This remarkable woman had been wife to Cambyses before his death, and briefly to the usurper whom Darius claimed to have eliminated. Her survival through such transitions, demonstrating political skills that marriage to the new king would allow her to exercise fully. The son she bore Darius carried in his veins what the father's bloodline lacked: unimpeachable connection to the dynasty's sacred founder, legitimacy that derived from Cyrus through channels no rival could match. The competition for succession had begun before Xerxes was old enough to understand what was at stake. Artabazanes stood as eldest son, his birth preceding his father's elevation to kingship. His mother, a woman Darius had married when he was merely a nobleman rather than the ruler of the world. By Persian custom, the firstborn held strong claims that younger siblings could not easily overcome. Yet Xerxes possessed what Artabazanes lacked: a mother whose descent from Cyrus made her sons something more than merely Darius's offspring. The grandson of the empire's founder held advantages that mere priority of birth could not outweigh. Atossa worked to secure her son's position with the determination of a woman who understood that her own fate depended upon his success. Her influence over Darius grew through years of partnership that combined political alliance with genuine affection, her counsel shaping decisions whose effects extended far beyond household matters. The king, who had built an empire through military genius and administrative innovation, found in this queen a partner whose judgment he trusted in affairs that lesser monarchs would have reserved for male advisors. Her advocacy for Xerxes proceeded through channels that court observers could recognize without always being able to document. The young prince received education appropriate to one who might rule the largest empire the world had known. Tutors instructed him in languages that administration required: Old Persian for ceremonies and inscriptions, Aramaic for the bureaucratic correspondence that held the empire together, Elamite and Babylonian for engagement with civilizations whose antiquity dwarfed Persia's relatively recent rise. He learned the laws that Darius had codified, the provincial structures that organized territories too vast for direct royal oversight, the protocols that governed relationships between the central authority and the satraps who represented it across distances that messages took weeks to traverse. Religious instruction occupied a place of particular importance in the training that shaped Xerxes' understanding of his role. The teachings of Zoroaster that the Achaemenids had embraced provided frameworks for comprehending the cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood, light and darkness, the wise Lord Ahura Mazda and the destructive spirit who opposed him. The king served as Ahura Mazda's chosen instrument on earth, his rule maintaining the righteous order that divine will intended to prevail. Xerxes absorbed these doctrines through rituals whose fire altars proclaimed the sacred flame's victory over darkness, the sacred Haoma drink connecting participants to divine energies that sustained proper order. The court at Susa and Persepolis exposed the young prince to the empire's diversity through delegations that arrived from every corner of the realm. Egyptian priests brought wisdom accumulated through millennia that predated Persian conquest. Babylonian scholars carried astronomical knowledge that had tracked celestial movements for longer than any other civilization. Greek philosophers from the Ionian cities that acknowledged Persian sovereignty offered perspectives shaped by traditions that differed fundamentally from those that Zoroastrian teachers conveyed. The empire's strength lay partly in its capacity to accommodate such variety, governing peoples without demanding that they abandon the customs that defined them. Gardens surrounding the royal residences provided settings for contemplation that balanced the grandeur of ceremonial spaces with environments scaled to human comfort. Water channeled from distant sources fed pools whose surfaces reflected skies that stretched cloudless through summer months, their margins planted with trees imported from provinces across the empire. The concept of paradise, a word that passed from Persian into languages that would carry it around the world, found physical expression in these enclosed gardens whose careful cultivation created beauty that announced the king's power to command even nature itself. Banquets displayed the empire's wealth through gatherings whose scale astonished visitors from less favored lands. Golden vessels held wines transported from vineyards whose locations guaranteed quality. Their contents poured for guests whose seating arrangements encoded hierarchies that courtiers spent careers learning to navigate. Musicians performed on instruments gathered from traditions spanning the empire's breadth, their melodies accompanying courses that presented the culinary achievements of civilizations from Egypt to India. Xerxes observed these occasions from positions of honor that his birth secured, his presence preparing him for the day when such spectacles would center on his own magnificence. The empire's military apparatus demonstrated capabilities that no potential challenger could ignore during the years when Xerxes moved through adolescence toward adulthood. The Immortals, 10,000 elite soldiers whose ranks were constantly maintained at full strength through immediate replacement of casualties, represented only the most famous element of forces that could mobilize resources from 3 continents. Cavalry from the eastern steppes, infantry from every province, naval contingents from maritime peoples whose seamanship Persians themselves did not possess. All stood ready to serve a king whose commands could set in motion movements that shook the world. The Greek campaign that would define his father's later years and his own reign began taking shape during this period of Xerxes' development. The Ionian revolt that flared between 499 and 493 BC challenged Persian authority over Greek cities along the Aegean coast. Their rebellion supported by Athens and Eretria in ways that demanded response once the uprising had been suppressed. Darius determined that the Greek mainland cities whose interference had prolonged the revolt must be punished, their submission to Persian authority establishing precedents that would discourage future meddling in imperial affairs. The expedition that reached Marathon in 490 BC ended in defeat that Persian power had rarely experienced, and Persian pride could not accept. The army that Darius dispatched to punish Athens and Eretria succeeded against the latter, but failed against the former, the Athenian hoplites driving Persian forces back to their ships in an engagement whose significance Greeks would celebrate for generations. The defeat stung not because it threatened the empire's existence. Marathon was a skirmish by Persian standards, but because it represented defiance that could not be permitted to stand unpunished. Darius began preparations for a second Greek expedition that would employ resources proportionate to the task of subduing peoples who had proven unexpectedly capable of resistance. The years following Marathon saw accumulation of forces, supplies, and infrastructure that announced intentions whose scale exceeded anything the first campaign had attempted. The Greeks who celebrated their victory could not imagine what the empire they had irritated was capable of bringing against them when properly motivated. The Egyptian revolt that erupted in 486 BC interrupted these preparations with demands that forced attention away from Greek punishment toward the more immediately threatening challenge of a province whose wealth and strategic position made its loyalty essential. Egypt's resources had flowed into Persian treasuries since Cambyses had conquered it decades before, its granaries and workshops supporting imperial enterprises across the realm. Rebellion there could not be deferred while armies marched toward distant Greece, its suppression requiring priority that Darius was preparing to assign when death intervened. The great king died in November of 486 BC, his Greek ambitions unfulfilled, his succession arrangements incomplete, his empire facing rebellion in one of its most valuable provinces. Xerxes stood ready to claim the inheritance that his mother's advocacy had secured, his preparation adequate though his experience remained limited. The empire of empires awaited a new king, its challenges demanding capabilities that the prince would have to demonstrate rather than merely assert. The throne that Cyrus had established and Darius had expanded would now pass to the grandson whose blood connected both founders, his reign about to begin amid crises that would test whether that blood carried the qualities that empire required. The terraces of Persepolis that had witnessed his childhood would soon witness his coronation, their stones receiving the footsteps of a king rather than merely a prince. The education that tutors had provided would face examination against realities that no classroom could simulate, and the name that meant ruling over heroes would require the young man who bore it to prove himself worthy of heroes whose achievements had created the inheritance he was about to receive. The ceremonies that transformed Xerxes from prince to king unfolded through rituals whose antiquity connected the new monarch to predecessors whose achievements had created the empire he was inheriting. Persepolis provided the setting for observances whose grandeur announced to witnesses from across the realm that power had passed to capable hands, its halls and terraces hosting delegations whose presence confirmed that the transition would proceed without the chaos that contested successions sometimes produced. Incense rose through air thick with significance, its fragrant spirals carrying prayers toward Ahura Mazda, whose blessing the new reign required. The coronation at Pasargadae carried even deeper symbolic weight, the ceremony occurring at the site where Cyrus the Great had established his capital before Persepolis existed. Here, Xerxes donned the robe that tradition held Cyrus himself had worn, the garment's transfer connecting grandson to grandfather across the intervening decades through fabric that had touched the founder's body. The ritual announced what Xerxes' bloodline already proclaimed. He was the legitimate heir of the dynasty's sacred originator, his right to rule deriving from connections that no competitor could match. The priests who officiated moved through prescribed sequences whose every gesture carried meaning that generations of repetition had sanctified. Fire altars blazed with the eternal flame that Zoroastrian worship maintained, their light symbolizing the truth that the king was sworn to uphold against the darkness that falsehood represented. Sacred words in the ancient tongue invoke divine protection for a reign whose success would demonstrate that Ahura Mazda's favor rested upon the new monarch. Xerxes received the crown and scepter that externalized authority he would spend his reign attempting to deserve. The advisors who had served Darius found their positions confirmed by a successor, whose wisdom recognized that continuity served stability better than the disruption that wholesale replacement would have caused. Experienced administrators whose knowledge of imperial systems exceeded what any new king could personally possess remained in offices where their competence continued benefiting governance. Satraps who had managed distant provinces received assurances that loyalty would be rewarded with continued trust. The empire's machinery would keep functioning, while its new master learned the intricacies that effective direction required. Yet consolidation could not proceed in the calm circumstances that peaceful succession would have permitted. Egypt's rebellion demanded response before any other priority could receive attention, its defiance threatening revenues and resources that the empire required for purposes including the Greek campaign that Darius had left unfinished. The province, whose ancient civilization had submitted to Persian rule since Cambyses' conquest, now challenged that submission with force that only force could overcome. Xerxes' first act as king would be suppression of a revolt whose success would encourage similar challenges throughout the realm. The Egyptian campaign of 485 BC demonstrated capabilities that the new king possessed, and willingness to employ them that his youth might have caused observers to doubt. Persian forces descended upon the rebellious province with efficiency that reflected the empire's organizational strengths, their numbers and discipline overwhelming resistance that Egyptian resources could not long sustain. The suppression proceeded with a thoroughness that announced Xerxes' determination to tolerate no defiance, his treatment of the defeated harsher than his father might have imposed, but effective in eliminating any possibility of renewed resistance. Achaemenes, Xerxes' brother, received appointment as satrap of the reconquered province, his blood relationship to the king guaranteeing loyalty that appointed officials might not provide with equal reliability. The arrangement placed family members in positions of trust that the empire's scale made difficult to monitor closely. Their self-interest aligned with the throne's stability in ways that bureaucratic appointment alone could not ensure. Egypt would remain under Achaemenid control for decades to come, its wealth flowing toward purposes that Persian priorities determined. Babylon presented challenges that proved more troubling than Egyptian rebellion had posed. the ancient city whose prestige exceeded even Egypt's refusing to accept the subordination that Persian conquest had imposed. Two revolts erupted in 484 and 482 BC, their leaders claiming royal titles that challenged Xerxes' legitimacy over territories whose cultural heritage predated Persia's existence by millennia. The Babylonians who rose against Achaemenid rule may have calculated that a new king, facing multiple challenges, would prove unable to respond effectively to all of them simultaneously. The response that Xerxes delivered exceeded anything Babylon's rebels had anticipated. Persian forces suppressed both uprisings with severity that made Egyptian treatment seem mild by comparison. The golden statue of Marduk, the city's patron deity whose cult had flourished since ages beyond memory, was removed from its temple and melted down, the destruction eliminating the ritual object whose possession legitimized claims to Babylonian kingship. The great temple of Esagila that had housed this statue for centuries suffered damage that announced Xerxes' contempt for traditions that Cyrus and Darius had respected. The treatment of Babylon revealed aspects of Xerxes' character that the earlier Egyptian campaign had only suggested. Where his predecessors had governed, conquered peoples through accommodation that preserved local customs and religions, Xerxes proved willing to employ destruction that humiliated the defeated and eliminated symbols around which future resistance might coalesce. The policy served practical purposes. No one could claim Babylonian kingship without Marduk's statue to legitimize the claim. But it also satisfied instincts that gentler approaches had restrained in previous reigns. The title, King of Babylon, that Cyrus and Darius had proudly borne, disappeared from Xerxes' official nomenclature after these suppressions, its absence announcing that Babylon had forfeited the dignity that recognition of its distinct identity had represented. The city that had dominated Mesopotamia for millennia became merely another subject territory, its special status erased, along with the cult objects that had symbolized its greatness. The decision represented a departure from Achaemenid tradition, whose long-term consequences later generations would debate. Administrative attention turned toward the systems that held the empire together, once immediate rebellions had been crushed. The royal road that connected Susa to Sardis across over 1,600 miles of territory received maintenance that ensured messages and armies could move with the speed that effective governance required. Way stations positioned at intervals of roughly 15 miles provided fresh horses for royal couriers, whose relay system could transmit urgent communications across the empire's breadth in times that astonished observers from less organized lands. The infrastructure that Darius had built continued functioning under his son's watchful attention. Taxation proceeded according to assessments that balanced revenue requirements against the capacity of provinces to pay, without suffering damage that would reduce future yields. Each satrapy contributed amounts calibrated to its resources: silver from some regions, gold from others, horses from the steppes, grain from the fertile crescents of Egypt and Mesopotamia, exotic goods from the empire's furthest reaches. The treasury that accumulated these contributions funded everything, from military expeditions to building projects, its management requiring skills that the king's administrators had developed through generations of experience. The character that emerged through these early challenges revealed a ruler whose capabilities matched the empire's scale, while displaying qualities that distinguished him from predecessors whose examples he could not entirely replicate. Xerxes possessed the determination that crisis demanded, his responses to rebellion demonstrating willingness to employ force without hesitation when circumstances required. Yet something harder than what Cyrus and Darius had shown accompanied this determination, a readiness to humiliate the defeated that served psychological purposes beyond practical necessity. Pride shaped decisions in ways that administrative calculation alone did not explain. The grandson of Cyrus understood that he bore responsibilities toward a legacy that the founder's achievements had established, the empire's glory requiring enhancement that mere maintenance would not provide. The Greek campaign that Darius had left unfinished offered opportunity for accomplishment that would secure Xerxes' own place in the succession of great kings. What his father had attempted and failed to complete, the son would achieve on a scale that would render the earlier effort insignificant by comparison. Religious observance occupied a place in Xerxes' routine that exceeded what political calculation alone would have required. The fire altars that Zoroastrian worship maintained received his attention with regularity that demonstrated genuine devotion rather than merely ceremonial compliance. His understanding of kingship placed the throne at the center of cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood. The monarch's role serving divine purposes that transcended earthly politics. The campaigns he would undertake represented not merely imperial expansion, but extension of the righteous order that Ahura Mazda intended to prevail. The decision to proceed with his father's Greek plans crystallized through deliberations whose exact chronology the sources do not permit reconstruction. Advisors offered counsel that ranged from enthusiasm for the project to warnings about risks that the expedition's scale would multiply. Xerxes listened with the attention that significant decisions warranted, weighing arguments whose merit varied with the perspectives that different advisors brought. The conclusion he reached reflected both inherited obligation and personal ambition. Greece would be punished for Marathon, its cities brought under Persian authority, the empire's western frontier secured through conquest that would eliminate the threat of future interference. The court that surrounded Xerxes as these plans developed included figures whose capabilities would shape the expedition's execution and whose advice would influence decisions that determined outcomes. Military commanders whose experience spanned campaigns across the empire's frontiers offered expertise in logistics and tactics that the operation would require. Naval specialists from Phoenician cities, whose seamanship Persians themselves lacked, contributed knowledge essential for the maritime dimensions that Greek geography made unavoidable. The apparatus that would translate royal will into coordinated action across 3 continents was assembling around purposes that the king had determined. Atossa remained a presence whose influence her son continued respecting, even as his own authority matured beyond the need for maternal guidance. The queen, whose advocacy had secured his succession, now watched as the king she had made, prepared to demonstrate that her confidence had been warranted. Her death during these years removed a figure whose steadying presence had shaped Xerxes' development from childhood through accession, her passing marking the end of a relationship that had defined his path to power. The years between Egyptian suppression and Greek departure saw transformation of intention into preparation on scales that previous military enterprises had never attempted. The empire's resources would be marshaled toward a single purpose whose achievement would secure Xerxes' reputation for generations. The young king, who had inherited an empire in crisis, was becoming the mature monarch whose ambitions matched the power at his disposal. The greatest expedition in history was taking shape in the imagination and the administrative apparatus of a ruler who believed himself capable of accomplishments that would exceed everything his predecessors had achieved. The terraces of Persepolis witnessed the planning sessions that translated vision into logistics, their stones silent observers of deliberations whose outcomes would reshape the ancient world. Scribes recorded decisions that commanders would implement across territories, whose diversity the expedition would display in concentrated form. The Empire of Empires was preparing to demonstrate its power against peoples who had dared to resist, their defiance about to meet response proportionate to the majesty they had offended. Xerxes stood at the center of these preparations, his confidence sustained by resources that no previous monarch had commanded and ambitions that no previous challenge had tested. The 4 years that separated the decision from the departure witnessed mobilization on a scale that the ancient world had never seen and would rarely see again. The empire's administrative machinery, refined through generations of experience governing territories spanning 3 continents, now directed its capabilities toward a single purpose whose achievement would demonstrate Persian power beyond any possibility of future doubt. Resources flowed from satrapies whose diversity encompassed nearly every environment the earth contained, their contributions assembling at staging points where organization transformed raw materials into the instruments of conquest. Engineers surveyed the route that the expedition would follow, their assessments identifying obstacles that preparation could eliminate, before the army's passage transformed inconvenience into catastrophe. The peninsula of Mount Athos, whose cape had destroyed Mardonius's fleet in the storm of 492 BC, presented a danger that Persian planners determined to circumvent through engineering rather than risk through navigation. The decision to cut a canal through the peninsula's narrowest point announced ambitions that geography itself would be required to accommodate. The Mount Athos Canal consumed 3 years of labor by workers drawn from subject peoples whose skills and bodies served purposes that royal command determined. The channel stretched approximately 1.25 miles across terrain, whose composition varied from sand to rock, the excavation requiring techniques adapted to conditions that changed along the route. Ships would pass through the completed canal 2 abreast, their passage eliminating the necessity of rounding a cape, whose waters had proven fatal to Persian naval ambitions a decade before. Observers then and since have questioned whether the canal served practical purposes proportionate to the effort its construction required. The route around the cape, while dangerous in storms, was navigable under normal conditions that careful timing could ensure. The Greeks who watched these preparations concluded that Xerxes was demonstrating power rather than solving problems, his canal announcing that Persian resources exceeded any rational requirement, and Persian will acknowledge no natural obstacles. Whether practical necessity or psychological warfare motivated the project, its completion demonstrated capabilities that no Greek city could hope to match. The Hellespont presented challenges that the canal's example suggested how Xerxes would address. The strait separating Asia from Europe measured roughly a mile across at the point selected for crossing, its currents and winds creating conditions that simple ferrying operations could not reliably manage for an army of the size that was assembling. Bridges of boats would span the water, their construction requiring naval resources and engineering expertise that the empire's subject peoples would provide. Phoenician and Egyptian shipwrights received the commission to construct bridges whose scale exceeded anything that previous military operations had attempted. Hundreds of vessels lashed together with cables of flax and papyrus would create roadways across which soldiers, horses, and wagons could pass as though traversing solid ground. The engineering that this required combined maritime knowledge with structural calculation in arrangements that demonstrated the empire's capacity to assemble and coordinate diverse specialized skills. The first bridges fell victim to a storm whose violence destroyed what months of labor had created. The waters of the Hellespont scattering vessels and snapping cables with indifference to the royal purposes they had been meant to serve. Xerxes' response to this disaster became legendary in the accounts that Greek historians would later compose, their narratives depicting a king whose anger at the sea's defiance led him to order punishments that rational observers would consider absurd. 300 lashes were administered to the waters, fetters thrown into the strait, the sea branded with hot irons, all expressing rage that nature had dared to obstruct the great king's will. Whether these stories reflected actual events, Greek embellishment designed to mock Persian pride, or some combination of both, the second set of bridges rose to replace what the storm had destroyed. The new structures incorporated lessons that failure had taught, their engineering improved by experience that the first attempt had provided. 2 bridges stood ready by spring of 480 BC, their spans awaiting the army whose crossing they would facilitate. The Hellespont that had defied Xerxes, now submitted to construction that announced human will, could overcome natural obstacles when sufficient resources supported sufficient determination. The army gathering at Sardis represented the empire's diversity in concentrated form, its contingents displaying the variety of peoples whose submission to Achaemenid rule the expedition simultaneously expressed and enforced. Herodotus catalogued 46 nations whose forces participated, his enumeration providing ethnographic detail that has fascinated readers for 25 centuries. The numbers he reported, over 1 million soldiers, thousands of ships, support personnel, multiplying the total beyond comprehension, reflected impressions rather than accurate counts. But the reality was impressive enough, even at more modest estimates, that modern scholars find plausible. Persians formed the expedition's core, the immortals whose 10,000 never diminished, providing elite forces whose quality anchored the larger mass of less distinguished troops. Median cavalry, whose horsemanship generations of practice had perfected, offered mobile striking power that infantry alone could not provide. Contingents from every corner of the empire added capabilities specific to their origins. Ethiopian archers, Indian cavalry, Scythian horsemen, Phrygian infantry. The procession of nations displaying Persian power to any observer and to each other. The naval forces gathered from peoples whose maritime traditions exceeded what Persia itself possessed. Phoenician ships represented the ancient world's finest naval architecture, their triple-banked triremes combining speed and striking power that centuries of Mediterranean warfare had refined. Egyptian vessels added numbers that mass required, even if individual quality varied. Greek ships from Ionian cities that remained under Persian authority contributed capabilities that would prove ironic when employed against their mainland kinsmen. Xerxes travelled from Persepolis to Sardis through territories whose populations witnessed the passage of power they could not hope to resist. The royal road that connected the empire's capitals provided the route along which the king and his immediate entourage moved, their progress marked by ceremonies at cities whose officials competed to demonstrate loyalty through the magnificence of their receptions. The journey that covered over 1,500 miles occupied months whose passage allowed the army's assembly to continue while the king approached the staging area. The council of Artabanus, Xerxes' uncle, provided perspective that enthusiasm for the expedition had otherwise overwhelmed. This elder statesman, whose experience spanned the reign of Darius, urged caution that the preparations' momentum made difficult to heed. The Greeks were formidable enemies whose terrain favored defense, whose naval capabilities might prove superior in confined waters, whose determination Marathon had demonstrated. The distance that separated Greece from Persia would stretch supply lines that enemy action might sever. Victory was not guaranteed, and defeat at such distance would prove difficult to reverse. Xerxes listened to these warnings with respect that his uncle's position demanded but rejected their conclusion, with confidence that the expedition's scale seemed to justify. No force that Greece could assemble could hope to resist what Persia was preparing to deploy. The logistical challenges that Artabanus identified would be overcome by the organizational capabilities that the empire's administration provided. The risks were real, but proportionate to rewards that success would secure. Not merely punishment of Greek defiance, but establishment of Persian authority over the entire Aegean world. Queen Artemisia of Halicarnassus demonstrated that gender did not prevent participation in the expedition's command structure. Her personal leadership of ships from her city, reflecting the diversity of arrangements through which the empire governed its subject peoples. This remarkable woman would prove one of the expedition's most capable commanders. Her counsel to Xerxes at crucial moments, demonstrating judgment that male advisors did not always match. Her presence reminded observers that the empire's strength derived partly from its willingness to employ talent wherever it appeared. The spring of 480 BC brought conditions suitable for the movement that years of preparation had made possible. The army that had gathered at Sardis set forth toward the crossing point, where bridges awaited their passage, the column stretching for miles along routes that could not contain such numbers without elaborate coordination. The enterprise that Darius had conceived, and death had prevented him from executing, was finally underway. Its completion, now the responsibility of the son whose ambitions had transformed inherited obligation into personal crusade. Religious observances accompanied the departure with rituals whose performance sought divine favor for the undertaking that human preparation had made possible. Priests offered sacrifices whose smoke rose toward heavens that Xerxes believed watched over his enterprise with approval. Libations poured into the Hellespont before the crossing acknowledged powers whose cooperation the strait's successful spanning required. The expedition proceeded with confidence that cosmic forces aligned with purposes that righteousness and power combined to sanctify. The crossing itself became spectacle whose witnesses would remember for the remainder of their lives. For 7 days and 7 nights, according to the accounts that have survived, the army flowed across bridges whose construction had demonstrated engineering capabilities that few cultures could have matched. Soldiers marched in formations whose order maintained discipline that such numbers might otherwise have dissolved. Cavalry led horses whose training allowed them to accept the strange sensation of walking on surfaces that moved with the water beneath. Wagons carried supplies whose transport the bridges had been designed to accommodate. Xerxes watched the crossing from a throne positioned to provide views that allowed him to observe the army, whose magnitude exceeded what any individual perspective could comprehend. The sight moved him, according to Herodotus, to tears whose meaning he explained to Artabanus. Of all these thousands passing before him, not one would be alive in 100 years. The brevity of human life rendering even such magnificence ultimately transient. The moment of philosophical reflection amid military preparation revealed aspects of Xerxes' character that his reputation for pride and anger might otherwise have obscured. The army stood on European soil, its presence announcing that the confrontation Darius had initiated and Marathon had interrupted was about to resume on scales that would determine whether Greece would remain independent or submit to the empire that now deployed against it. The preparations that had consumed 4 years and resources beyond calculation had achieved their purpose of delivering Persian power to positions from which Greek resistance could be systematically overwhelmed. The campaign that would define Xerxes' reign and shape Mediterranean history for centuries had begun. The landscape of Thrace unfolded before the advancing army and terrain, whose variety tested the logistical arrangements that years of preparation had established. Forests of oak and pine covered hills that rose and fell in rhythms, requiring roads where paths had previously sufficed, their construction proceeding as the army advanced through territories whose populations watched the passage of power they could not hope to resist. Rivers whose crossings demanded engineering, that the Hellespont bridges had proven Persian capabilities, could provide interrupted progress at intervals that planners had anticipated and prepared to address. The columns stretched for distances that defied easy comprehension, its components moving at paces that their nature determined. Infantry, maintaining steady progress along routes that cavalry had scouted, supply wagons following at speeds that laden vehicles could manage, naval forces paralleling the land army's advance along coastlines, whose harbours provided the anchorages that maritime operations required. The coordination that such movement demanded reflected administrative capabilities that the empire had developed through generations of governing territories, whose scale prepared it for exactly such enterprises. Macedonia submitted without the resistance that its geography might have made possible, the kingdom's rulers calculating that accommodation would preserve more than defiance could protect. The Persian host received hospitality, whose sincerity varied with assessments of how permanently Persian power might remain once the expedition had achieved its purposes. Food and fodder that the army consumed depleted stores that Macedonian agriculture had accumulated, the passage of such numbers leaving marks upon the landscape that seasons would be required to erase. The route southward carried the army toward the pass at Thermopylae, whose geography would compress the confrontation that numbers alone should have made one-sided into engagements where terrain neutralized numerical advantages. The mountains that formed Greece's spine pressed close to the sea at this point, creating a corridor so narrow that the thousands upon thousands of Persian soldiers could not deploy in formations that would bring their weight to bear against defenders positioned to exploit the constriction. The hot gates, as the Greeks called the pass for the thermal springs that warmed its waters, would become the site of resistance whose fame would far outlast its military significance. The Greeks who awaited the Persian advance at Thermopylae had chosen their position with understanding of how geography might compensate for the disparity in forces that open battle would have made decisive. The Spartan king, Leonidas, commanded a force whose size the sources report variously, but whose inadequacy against the army approaching was apparent regardless of exact numbers. The narrow passage would allow only limited Persian forces to engage at any moment, the advantage of numbers negated by a bottleneck that courage and skill might hold against multitudes. Xerxes established his position with patience that the strategic situation seemed to justify. The Greeks blocking the pass could not hope to resist indefinitely, their supplies limited, their numbers insufficient for the extended defense that protracted resistance would require. Time favored the attacker, whose resources dwarfed what the defenders could command. The king, who had crossed the Hellespont and traversed Thrace and Macedonia, could afford to wait while circumstances that geography had created and Greek stubbornness was prolonging gradually shifted toward the resolution that Persian power made inevitable. The assaults that Persian forces launched against the pass encountered resistance whose intensity exceeded what their commanders had anticipated. The confined space that prevented Persian numbers from telling also prevented the easy victory that those numbers should have guaranteed. Days passed in efforts that produced casualties, without producing the breakthrough that would open the route to central Greece. The Spartans who formed the defense's core demonstrated qualities that would make Thermopylae a watchword for martial valor across centuries that had not yet begun. The path that circumvented the Greek position became known to Persian commanders through information that a local resident named Ephialtes provided. The mountain trail that wound through terrain the defenders had not adequately secured offered passage for forces whose arrival behind the Greek line would render continued defense impossible. Xerxes dispatched his immortals along this route, their night march carrying them toward positions from which the pass's defenders would find themselves trapped between forces they could not hope to overcome. The final day at Thermopylae saw the resolution that geography had postponed and betrayal had made possible. Most of the Greek forces withdrew when the encirclement became apparent, their departure leaving Leonidas and his Spartans to face the conclusion that honor demanded they not avoid. The stand they made became legendary in ways that military significance alone would not have justified, their deaths purchasing time whose value later events would render questionable, while creating stories whose inspirational power would persist for millennia. The pass stood open, its defenders fallen, the route to central Greece available for the advance that 4 years of preparation had been designed to enable. Xerxes ordered the body of Leonidas beheaded and crucified, the treatment expressing anger that the delay had inspired while violating customs that Greek and Persian traditions alike normally observed regarding the honored dead. The decision revealed aspects of royal character that victory had not softened, the grandson of Cyrus displaying harshness that the dynasty's founder would not have shown. The army flowed through Thermopylae into territories whose populations faced choices that the pass's fall had made urgent, cities whose walls might have provided protection against lesser forces, calculated whether resistance could succeed against power that had brushed aside Spartan valor. Most chose submission that preservation of life and property seemed to require, their capitulation adding to the momentum that each additional surrender reinforced. The Greek alliance that had formed to resist Persian aggression was fragmenting under pressure that unity might have withstood, but division could not survive. Athens presented a situation whose peculiarity reflected decisions that the city's leaders had made in anticipation of exactly the circumstances now unfolding. The population had evacuated before Persian forces arrived, their departure leaving a city whose streets stood empty and whose buildings awaited whatever fate the conquerors would impose. The Acropolis held a small garrison whose resistance delayed but could not prevent the occupation that Athens's abandonment had made inevitable. The city that had sent ships to support the Ionian revolt, that had provided the hoplites who triumphed at Marathon, now lay open to vengeance that a decade of accumulated grievance had prepared. The burning of Athens proceeded through stages whose completeness announced the thoroughness of Persian anger. Temples whose antiquity stretched back generations became fuel for fires whose smoke rose over a city that conquest had emptied of the population that might have witnessed its destruction. The Acropolis, whose sacred structures had crowned the city's heights for centuries, received particular attention, its shrines demolished with deliberation that expressed purposes beyond mere military necessity. Xerxes was not simply conquering Athens, but erasing symbols of the defiance that had humiliated his father's expedition. Yet the Athenians themselves had escaped destruction that their city could not avoid, their evacuation having removed the population whose survival mattered more than structures that peace might eventually allow rebuilding. The fleet that carried Athens's military strength remained intact at Salamis, its presence complicating Persian calculations about how the campaign should proceed. The city had been taken, but the citizens whose submission would have made the conquest meaningful continued resisting from positions that naval power made accessible. The waters around Salamis presented strategic challenges that the campaign's land successes did not address. The Greek fleet, gathered in the straits between the island and the mainland, represented capabilities that Persian naval forces would need to overcome before the campaign could achieve the complete victory that its costs demanded. The Athenian ships that formed the alliance's core had not been defeated by the city's fall, their crews as determined as ever to resist the empire whose armies had occupied their homes. Xerxes positioned himself to observe the naval engagement, whose outcome would determine whether Greek resistance could continue. A throne placed on the slopes of Mount Agaleo provided views across the straits where fleets were maneuvering toward confrontation. Scribes attended the king to record the deeds of commanders, whose performance would earn reward or punishment, depending on assessments that royal observation would inform. The stage was set for a battle whose consequences would exceed what any participant could have anticipated. The council that preceded the engagement reflected divisions within the Persian command, whose resolution would shape tactical decisions. Most of Xerxes' advisors urged the aggressive action that the campaign's momentum seemed to support, their confidence sustained by successes that Thermopylae and Athens had represented. Artemisia alone counseled caution, her assessment warning that confined waters would neutralize the numerical advantages that Persian naval forces possessed. The Greeks fought best in such conditions, she argued, while the diverse contingents of the Persian fleet lacked the coordination that close-quarters combat would demand. Xerxes chose to fight, the decision reflecting confidence that the Queen of Halicarnassus could not shake despite the respect her judgment had earned. The Straits of Salamis would witness the confrontation that would determine whether Greek naval power could survive the army's advance, or whether Persian domination would become complete. The morning of the battle brought conditions whose effects the commanders on both sides would discover as engagement developed. The battle unfolded through hours, whose details the sources preserve imperfectly, but whose outcome they record with certainty. The confined waters that Artemisia had warned about indeed prevented Persian numbers from achieving the concentration that would have made them decisive. Greek ships, whose crews knew these waters, intimately maneuvered, with advantages that familiarity provided. The coordination that Persian naval forces lacked proved as damaging as Artemisia had predicted, their contingents from different nations failing to maintain the cohesion that effective naval combat required. The defeat that darkness ended and morning confirmed presented Xerxes with realities that confidence had not prepared him to accept. The fleet that should have completed the conquest that land forces had advanced lay damaged beyond the capacity for immediate renewal, its losses requiring resources that the campaign's distance from Persian heartlands made difficult to provide. The Greek alliance that land victories had seemed to be dissolving had demonstrated at sea capabilities that could not be safely ignored. The calculations that had made the expedition seem certain to succeed now required revision that strategic prudence demanded. The decision to withdraw the main army from Greece reflected assessments whose realism the expedition's initial confidence had obscured. Winter was approaching. Supply lines stretched across territories whose submission Persian retreat might encourage to reconsider. The fleet's losses left the army vulnerable to disruptions that maintained Greek naval power might accomplish. Xerxes would return to Asia with forces sufficient to protect his person and his dignity, while leaving Mardonius with select troops to complete, by continued campaigning, what the expedition's first season had not achieved. The crossing back to Asia reversed the triumphant passage that spring had witnessed. The bridges that had carried the army into Europe now carrying its king back toward territories where Persian power remained unquestioned. The campaign that had begun with confidence, exceeded only by its scale, was ending in circumstances that required careful presentation to preserve royal dignity. Greece remained unconquered, its resistance sustained by naval victory, whose effects land success had not overcome. Mardonius remained with forces whose quality exceeded what their reduced numbers might suggest. His mission to achieve in the coming season what Xerxes' personal presence had not accomplished. The commander whose counsel had helped persuade Xerxes to undertake the expedition now bore responsibility for justifying that advice through results that the king's departure made his to achieve or fail to achieve. The winter that separated the campaign's seasons would provide opportunity for preparation, whose adequacy the spring would test. The battles at Plataea and Mycale in 479 BC completed what Salamis had begun, their outcomes eliminating the forces that Mardonius commanded and the naval power that Persian presence in the Aegean required. Greece would remain independent, its cities free to develop along paths that Persian conquest would have foreclosed. The campaign that had promised to extend Achaemenid authority across the Aegean world had instead demonstrated limits to Persian power that Greek resistance had revealed. Xerxes learned of these final defeats from the distance that his return to Asia had established, their news requiring acceptance of failure that his father's ghost might have found grimly familiar. The palace complexes that received Xerxes upon his return from Greece provided settings whose grandeur announced that failure in distant campaigns had not diminished the magnificence that the empire's heartland maintained. Persepolis rose from its terrace in arrangements whose scale and beauty proclaimed power that no Greek victory could threaten. Its halls and courtyards continuing to function as the ceremonial center of an empire whose extent still exceeded anything the Mediterranean world could match. The king who had failed to conquer Greece remained the ruler of territories stretching from Egypt to India, his authority unquestioned across satrapies whose combined resources dwarfed what his Greek opponents commanded. The administrative rhythms that had continued during the campaign's months resumed their normal patterns as the king's presence restored the center around which imperial governance revolved. Satraps, whose reports had accumulated during the period of military preoccupation, received audiences whose outcomes determined policies affecting millions of subjects. Disputes that provincial authorities could not resolve reached the throne for adjudication, whose finality the king's decision provided. The machinery of empire that had functioned during absence now functioned with the enhanced efficiency that royal attention permitted. The building programs that would become Xerxes' most enduring legacy received the focus that the Greek campaign's conclusion freed him to provide. His father Darius had begun transforming Persepolis from ceremonial site into the architectural expression of Achaemenid power. But death had interrupted projects whose completion Xerxes now undertook. The construction that filled the years following the Greek retreat produced monuments whose survival would eventually exceed the empire itself, their stones preserving Achaemenid achievement long after the dynasty that created them had passed into history. The Apadana that Darius had begun and left unfinished received the attention that completion required, its vast audience hall taking final form under Xerxes' supervision. The hypostyle space that emerged could accommodate thousands of visitors beneath a roof supported by columns whose height exceeded 60 feet, their capitals carved with the bull and lion figures that Achaemenid architectural vocabulary employed. The staircases that provided access to this hall bore reliefs depicting the empire's subject peoples in procession, their tribute-bearing figures creating a catalogue of nations whose diversity the stone preserved for audiences stretching across millennia. The Gate of All Nations rose to provide formal entrance to the terrace complex, its construction announcing through nomenclature the universal claims that Persian kingship asserted. Colossal bull figures flanked passages through which visitors from every corner of the empire would pass, their scale designed to impress observers with the power they were approaching. The inscriptions that Xerxes placed upon this structure proclaimed in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, the achievements and piety that he wished posterity to remember. The gate's survival into the modern era has made it one of the most recognizable symbols of Achaemenid civilization. The Hall of 100 Columns that Xerxes initiated represented ambitions that the Apadana's completion had not exhausted. This throne hall would exceed even the great audience hall in the scale of its columned interior, its 100 pillars supporting a roof over a space whose dimensions made it among the largest enclosed structures the ancient world produced. The construction that began during these years would continue beyond Xerxes' lifetime, its completion falling to successors whose reigns would add their contributions to a complex that generations of Achaemenid kings had shaped. The terraces and gardens that surrounded these monumental structures provided environments whose beauty softened the grandeur that ceremonial architecture projected. Water channeled from sources in the surrounding mountains fed pools and fountains whose presence created coolness that the Persian summer's heat made precious. Trees imported from across the empire's breadth provided shade beneath canopies, whose diversity displayed the reach of royal power as eloquently as any inscription. The paradise gardens that Persian culture had developed reached their fullest expression in these royal precincts, their cultivation demonstrating mastery over nature that complemented the political mastery over nations that the reliefs proclaimed. The domestic life of the court proceeded through arrangements whose complexity reflected the household's scale and the political significance that royal relationships carried. Queen Amestris occupied the position of chief wife, with influence that her strong personality made formidable, her presence shaping court dynamics in ways that the king's other women could not match. The children whose births had secured succession, and whose education prepared them for responsibilities that maturity would bring, grew toward adulthood in environments whose luxury coexisted with pressures that royal birth imposed. Crown Prince Darius represented the future that careful arrangement was designed to ensure, his position as designated heir placing him at the center of attention that his status warranted and his character would need to justify. The training that prepared him for eventual succession combined the martial skills that Achaemenid tradition valued with the administrative understanding that governing so vast an empire required. His relationship with his father developed through years, when proximity permitted observation of kingship exercised and lessons absorbed through example rather than instruction alone. The religious policies that Xerxes pursued during these years of domestic focus revealed convictions that the Greek campaign's outcome had not shaken. The diver inscription that he composed proclaimed destruction of temples dedicated to deities he considered false. The divers, whose worship Zoroastrian theology condemned as service to the forces of darkness. The tolerance that Cyrus and Darius had generally shown towards subject peoples' religious practices gave way under Xerxes to interventions whose theological motivation produced destruction that political calculation alone would not have suggested. The inscription's declaration that he had destroyed a place where Daivas had previously been worshipped and established worship of Ahura Mazda in its place announced religious activism that departed from his predecessor's more accommodating approach. Whether this represented policy applied broadly across the empire, or referred to specific incidents whose context the text does not provide. The tone suggested a king whose religious certainties exceeded the pluralism that imperial diversity might have counseled. The relationship between this religious intensity and the Babylonian temple's destruction earlier in his reign remains a question that scholars continue to debate. Diplomatic exchanges with the satrapies and with peoples beyond the empire's boundaries continued the relationships that imperial position required maintaining. Egypt, whose rebellion had demanded suppression at the reign's beginning, remained under the administration that Xerxes' brother Achaemenes provided. Babylon, humiliated by the destructions that the revolts had occasioned, continued contributing the economic resources that its fertile territories produced. The western satrapies, whose proximity to Greece made them sensitive zones, received attention that their strategic importance warranted. The Aegean world that the Greek campaign had failed to subjugate continued developing along paths that Persian influence affected without controlling. The Greek cities of Ionia remained under Achaemenid authority, their tribute continuing to flow toward Persian treasuries despite the defeats that their kinsmen on the mainland had inflicted. The boundary between Persian and Greek spheres of influence stabilized along lines that military outcome had established, neither side possessing the capacity or inclination to alter arrangements that exhaustion had imposed. The court life that surrounded Xerxes during these years of domestic focus combined the ceremonial magnificence that royal dignity required with the administrative functionality that governing demanded. Audiences followed protocols whose elaboration announced the distance between ordinary subjects and the king whose power derived from divine favor. The prostration that approaching the royal presence required expressed submission that Persian subjects accepted as appropriate, while Greek observers considered degrading. The rituals that structured court existence created rhythms whose regularity provided framework for lives lived in proximity to power, whose exercise affected millions. Advisors whose influence had survived the campaign's disappointments continued providing counsel that royal decisions required. The officials who managed the empire's various departments brought expertise in domains ranging from military logistics to financial administration to diplomatic protocol. Eunuchs whose position within the household gave them access that their physical condition made politically safe accumulated influence that their nominal status might have seemed to preclude. The court's complexity created networks of alliance and rivalry, whose navigation demanded skills that newcomers acquired only through painful experience. The treasury, whose accumulations funded the building projects, and the court's magnificence received the additions that taxation and tribute provided. The silver and gold that flowed from satrapies across the empire filled storerooms whose contents represented wealth that contemporary observers could barely comprehend. The administrative systems that Darius had refined continued functioning with efficiency, that ensured revenue collection proceeded according to assessments that balanced extraction with the sustainability that imperial longevity required. Xerxes' character during these years of mature rule displayed qualities that the Greek campaign's stresses had perhaps intensified rather than created. The pride that had driven the expedition's scale remained evident in building programs whose grandeur exceeded practical necessity. The religious conviction that the diver inscription expressed suggested intensification of beliefs that military failure had not weakened and may have strengthened. The remove from daily affairs that increasing reliance on officials permitted created distance between king and subjects that his predecessors had maintained less completely. The harem, whose size reflected royal status and political alliance, housed women whose competition for favor created dynamics that the king's attention could exacerbate or moderate. Amestris maintained her preeminence through force of personality that other wives could not match, her influence extending into matters that court women did not typically affect. The intrigues that such environments generated produced stories whose accuracy the source's distance from events makes difficult to verify, but whose circulation suggests patterns that contemporaries found plausible. The passage of years, accumulated experience whose weight pressed upon a king who had already endured disappointments that his youth's confidence had not anticipated. The Greek failure remained a fact that no subsequent success could erase, its memory perhaps contributing to withdrawal from the expansive ambitions that had motivated the expedition. The empire that Xerxes governed was vast enough that its proper administration provided purpose sufficient for any reign, its internal development mattering more than conquests that the Greek campaign had proven costlier than anticipated. The building projects continued rising toward completion as the years advanced, their stones ascending in courses that craftsmen laid with skill that generations of practice had perfected. The reliefs that decorated their surfaces preserved images of an empire at the height of its power, the tribute bearers and guardians frozen in eternal procession toward a king whose mortality the stone's permanence would long outlast. Xerxes was creating monuments designed to speak to posterity, their messages encoding achievements that he wished remembered and omitting failures that he preferred forgotten. The transition from the active warfare of the reign's first years to the domestic focus of its latter period marked evolution in a king whose capabilities had proven better suited to some challenges than others. The builder whose vision Persepolis expressed, the administrator whose systems maintained imperial function, the religious devotee whose convictions shaped policy. These aspects of Xerxes would outlast the memory of military campaigns, whose outcomes had disappointed the ambitions that launched them. The empire remained powerful, prosperous, and stable, its daily functioning more significant for most of its subjects than distant battles, whose results affected borderlands rather than heartlands. Yet the stability that characterized these years contained seeds of disruption, whose growth would eventually produce consequences that the king's attention had not anticipated. The court, whose complexity served administrative purposes, also created environments where ambition could develop toward outcomes that threatened rather than served the throne. The officials whose capabilities made royal withdrawal possible also accumulated influence that royal re-engagement might find difficult to reclaim. The final years of Xerxes' reign would demonstrate that withdrawal from active governance carried risks that the tranquility of these middle years had obscured. The court that surrounded Xerxes in his later years had evolved into an organism whose complexity exceeded what any single intelligence could fully comprehend. Networks of influence spread through chambers and corridors, whose geography encoded hierarchies that newcomers spent years learning to navigate. Officials whose formal positions provided frameworks for authority exercised power, whose actual extent depended upon relationships that no organizational chart could capture. The king who sat at this web's center found himself increasingly dependent upon intermediaries, whose perspectives shaped his understanding of the realm he nominally controlled. The eunuchs whose physical condition made them safe for intimate access to royal quarters had accumulated influence that their technical status as servants obscured. These men, whose careers began in subordination, had discovered that proximity to power could translate into power itself, their control over access to the king becoming leverage that ambitious courtiers could not ignore. The chamberlains who managed the household's daily functioning made decisions that affected outcomes across the empire, their preferences shaping which petitions reached royal attention and which disappeared into archives that no one would ever consult. Aspamitres had risen to a position of particular prominence among these influential servants, his role as chamberlain placing him at intersections through which much of the palace's business flowed. The eunuch, whose career had advanced through years of useful service, had accumulated knowledge of court dynamics, whose value extended beyond the administrative functions his position formally encompassed. The relationships he maintained with figures across the palace hierarchy created networks whose activation could produce effects that formal authority alone might not have achieved. The royal bodyguard, whose function was protection of the king's person, had developed under its commander Artabanus into an institution whose loyalty the commander's ambitions had complicated. This Artabanus, distinct from the elderly uncle who had counseled caution before the Greek campaign, held military authority whose scope made him one of the most powerful figures in the empire. The soldiers who answered to his command controlled access to the king through physical means that paralleled the administrative control that eunuchs like Aspamitres exercised through household management. The relationship between these two powerful figures developed through channels that the historical record illuminates only partially. What drew them together, shared grievances, mutual ambition, calculated alliance, or circumstances that neither had entirely planned, remains subject to speculation that the sources do not resolve. Their positions complemented each other in ways that cooperation would have made natural to recognize. The commander who controlled the guards and the chamberlain who controlled the doors together held keys to possibilities that neither could have pursued alone. Xerxes moved through his later years with patterns that suggested withdrawal from the active engagement that his reign's earlier decades had displayed. The audiences that brought petitioners before the throne occurred with reduced frequency, their scheduling controlled by officials whose assessments of worthiness determined who received the opportunity to present their cases. The building projects that had consumed his attention continued under supervision that the king's direct involvement no longer provided. The religious observances, whose performance remained important, occupied time that administration had previously claimed. The gardens that surrounded the palace complexes received visits whose frequency suggested that their tranquility provided satisfactions that court business could not match. The king, whose youth had been shaped by expectations of conquest, and whose prime had been consumed by campaigns and construction, now found in cultivated nature pleasures that human affairs had ceased providing. The paradise that Persian gardening had created offered retreat from complexities that the throne's demands had made exhausting. The waters whose sounds masked conversations and the trees whose shade cooled afternoons became companions whose company Xerxes increasingly preferred. Religious ritual occupied a place in daily routine that exceeded what political calculation required. The fire altars, whose flames represented the sacred light that Ahura Mazda had kindled, received attention that genuine devotion, rather than mere ceremony, motivated. The prayers whose recitation connected the king to cosmic struggles between truth and falsehood provided frameworks for understanding disappointments that political analysis could not adequately explain. The Greek campaign's failure might have resulted from divine purposes whose wisdom human understanding could not penetrate. The apparent setback serving plans whose ultimate rightness would eventually become clear. The succession that should have been settled remained subject to uncertainties that the king's withdrawal had allowed to fester. Crown Prince Darius held the designated position that his father's formal declaration had established. But the passage of years without the prince assuming responsibilities that would have confirmed his readiness created space for questions that clarity might have foreclosed. Other sons, whose ambitions their positions frustrated, observed the situation with attention that the outcome's uncertainty encouraged. The arrangements that should have provided security instead provided opportunities for those whose interests alternative outcomes might serve. The empire beyond the court continued functioning with the stability that administrative systems maintained, regardless of the attention that rulers devoted to their oversight. Satraps governed provinces whose distance from the capital made local competence more important than central supervision. Tax revenues flowed toward treasuries, whose accumulations funded the court's magnificence, and the garrisons whose presence maintained order. The roads that connected the realm's distant parts carried commerce and communication, whose volume demonstrated prosperity that political uncertainties at the center had not disrupted. The Greek world that had proven resistant to conquest continued developing, along paths that Persian ambitions had failed to foreclose. Athens was rebuilding the temples that Xerxes' forces had destroyed, their reconstruction funded by revenues from the alliance that Greek victory had enabled. The confederacy that opposed Persian power was transforming into an Athenian empire, whose extraction of tribute from member states mirrored practices that Persian administration had long employed. The defeat that Xerxes had suffered was producing consequences whose significance exceeded the military outcomes that battles had determined. Cultural production within the Achaemenid realm continued generating achievements, whose quality demonstrated that military setbacks had not diminished the civilization's creative vitality. Craftsmen whose skills had produced the reliefs adorning Persepolis continued working in traditions that court patronage sustained. The metalwork and textiles, the jewelry and ceramics that Persian workshops produced, maintained standards of excellence that markets across the ancient world valued. The empire's prosperity supported artistic endeavor, whose results enriched lives that political dramas at the highest levels did not touch. The philosophical and religious developments that Zoroastrian tradition was undergoing during these years reflected intellectual vitality that royal patronage encouraged without entirely controlling. The priests whose interpretations of sacred teachings shaped how believers understood their obligations were developing doctrines whose implications extended beyond ritual observance into ethical commitments that daily life should express. The concepts of judgment after death, of cosmic struggle between good and evil, of individual responsibility for choosing the righteous path. These ideas were taking forms that would influence religious traditions far beyond Zoroastrianism's boundaries. The queen, whose influence had shaped court dynamics for decades, maintained her position as Xerxes withdrew into patterns that reduced his engagement with the human complexities that surrounded him. Amestris continued exercising the authority that her personality and position combined to provide. Her interventions in court affairs, reflecting judgments whose consequences affected outcomes across the realm. The relationship between this formidable woman and her increasingly withdrawn husband evolved through phases that the sources permit only glimpses of understanding. The princes, whose futures depended upon succession arrangements, watched their father's declining engagement with mixtures of concern and calculation that their situations made natural. Crown Prince Darius waited for elevation, that each passing year made more urgent, while his father's continued life made impossible to hasten. Younger sons, whose positions, formal designation, had subordinated assessed possibilities that altered circumstances might create. The family dynamics that royal households generated combined affection with competition in proportions that varied among individuals and shifted with developments that changed the landscape of possibility. The atmosphere of the court during these final years carried weight that sensitive observers could perceive without being able to articulate precisely. Something had changed in the rhythm of palace life, some quality of attention or expectation that differed from what earlier years had contained. The king's withdrawal had created spaces that others had filled, the influence that accumulated in those spaces generating potentials whose direction remained unclear. Those whose positions depended upon the current arrangement felt vulnerabilities that stability would have precluded, while those whose ambitions the arrangement frustrated sensed opportunities that flux might provide. Artabanus and Aspamitres moved through this atmosphere with purposes that their daily functions masked. The commander whose soldiers guarded the king and the chamberlain whose management controlled access to royal quarters maintained the appearances that their positions required, while developing possibilities that those positions enabled. Whatever grievances motivated them, whatever ambitions drove them, whatever calculations persuaded them that risks worth taking existed, these factors combined in minds whose interior processes the historical record cannot recover. The nights at Persepolis brought darkness that torches and oil lamps pushed back without entirely defeating, their flames creating shadows that moved across walls whose reliefs depicted power that daylight proclaimed more confidently. The guards who maintained their stations through watches that divided the hours performed duties whose regularity provided security that the empire had long enjoyed. The servants who attended to household functions moved through corridors whose geography they knew intimately, their presence unremarkable, their purposes assumed to be as routine as their movements appeared. Xerxes passed through his days without apparent awareness that the arrangements sustaining his existence contained elements whose reliability he should not have assumed. The trust that kingship traditionally inspired had perhaps become habit rather than assessment, the protections that surrounded the throne seeming so natural that their dependence upon human loyalty escaped notice. The king, who had led armies across the Hellespont and watched fleets clash in the Straits of Salamis, now navigated a court whose dangers differed from those that military campaigns presented, but proved no less capable of producing fatal outcomes. The transition toward whatever awaited approached through increments whose accumulation only retrospect would reveal. Each day that passed without incident confirmed assumptions that the next day would resemble its predecessors, the pattern's regularity obscuring the possibility that patterns could break. The court continued its functions, the empire continued its administration, the building projects continued their progress toward completion. The appearance of normalcy that these continuities projected concealed developments whose eventual emergence would transform appearance into something that normalcy could not describe. The reliefs on Persepolis's walls depicted a world of order whose maintenance the king's power guaranteed, the processions of tribute-bearers and guardians suggesting stability that extended from the terraces where they were carved to the horizons where the empire's boundaries lay. The images announced confidence that Achaemenid rule would endure as permanently as the stone that bore them, their messages designed for audiences whose distance in time the artists could anticipate but not comprehend. The king, whose reign these monuments celebrated, would soon discover that stone outlasted flesh, that carved proclamations of power survived the power they proclaimed, and that the arrangements sustaining royal existence could dissolve as suddenly as morning mist, when the sun that had seemed to warm instead began to burn. The final turning point approached through the quiet corridors of a palace that had witnessed the exercise of power across generations of Achaemenid rule. The king whose ancestors had built the empire and whose own reign had maintained it, despite disappointments that ambition had suffered, moved through spaces whose beauty his family's patronage had created. The shadows that evening, brought to chambers whose days had been filled with the business of governance, were lengthening toward a darkness from which, for Xerxes, no dawn would provide emergence. The night of August 465 BC settled over Persepolis with the stillness that summer evenings in the Persian highlands provided, the air cooling as the sun's heat released from stone that had absorbed it through daylight hours. The palace complex, whose construction had occupied decades of Xerxes' attention, stood quiet beneath stars whose patterns Babylonian astronomers had tracked for millennia, their light falling upon terraces and colonnades that would outlast the dynasty that created them. Within chambers whose walls bore images of eternal order, arrangements whose permanence those images proclaimed were about to demonstrate their fragility, the guards whose function was protection of the royal person had become the instruments of its destruction, their commander's conspiracy having corrupted the loyalty upon which the throne's security depended. Artabanus moved through the palace with purpose that his position made unremarkable, his presence in corridors where the king's safety was his responsibility, raising no alarms among those who observed his passage. Aspamitres had ensured that doors would open and obstacles would part for an approach that administrative authority had cleared. The mechanisms that should have protected instead facilitated. The trust that Xerxes had extended repaid with betrayal, whose completeness his final moments would reveal. The bedchamber where the king lay offered no resistance to those whose entry their positions authorized. The sovereign who had commanded armies that shook the earth and fleets that darkened seas with their numbers now rested vulnerable in the sleep that human bodies required, regardless of the power their waking hours wielded. The attendants whose presence might have provided warning or resistance had been managed by conspirators whose planning had addressed such details. The space where Xerxes had expected safety became instead the site of his ending. The death came swiftly in the source's telling, though what swiftness meant for one experiencing it, the sources do not contemplate. The king, who had ruled for over 20 years, whose reign had encompassed the greatest military expedition history had yet witnessed, whose building programs had created monuments that still inspire wonder. This man passed from existence through violence that his own servants inflicted. The grandson of Cyrus, the son of Darius, the king who had burned Athens and bridged the Hellespont, died in darkness that his assassins had created and his own trust had enabled. The aftermath unfolded through hours, when confusion served the conspirators' purposes better than clarity would have done. Artabanus moved to secure his position through accusations that directed suspicion toward targets whose elimination would remove obstacles to ambitions that the assassination had been designed to advance. Crown Prince Darius, whose succession Xerxes' death should have triggered, found himself accused of the murder that had actually been committed by those now bringing charges. The manipulation that followed demonstrated planning, whose thoroughness extended beyond the killing itself into the political arrangements that were meant to follow. The young prince Artaxerxes learned of his father's death and his brother's alleged guilt through channels that the conspirators controlled. Whether he believed the accusations against Darius or merely recognized the situation's requirements, his response aligned with what Artabanus had calculated it would be. Crown Prince Darius died, executed for a crime he had not committed or eliminated as a rival whose continued existence threatened arrangements that the actual murderers preferred. The son who should have inherited became instead a victim of the same conspiracy that had killed his father. Artabanus's own ambitions extended beyond the role of kingmaker that successful conspiracy might have secured. The commander who had orchestrated regicide apparently intended to claim the throne itself, his plans projecting assumption of power that eliminating both Xerxes and his designated heir was meant to enable. The boldness of this ambition reflected either confidence that his position made success possible, or desperation whose sources the historical record does not reveal. The outcome would demonstrate that even successful conspiracy against a king did not guarantee that the conspirator could become king himself. Artaxerxes proved more capable than those who had manipulated him had anticipated, or perhaps the networks of loyalty that Achaemenid kingship had developed proved more resilient than conspirators had calculated. The young prince, who had been guided toward eliminating his brother, recognized, through his own perception or through counsel that others provided, that the threat to his position had not ended with Darius's death. Artabanus himself represented danger, that survival required addressing. The hunter became the hunted, as arrangements shifted in directions that the conspiracy's architect had not controlled. The death of Artabanus completed the cycle of violence that his conspiracy had initiated, his elimination removing the threat that his continued existence would have posed while providing justice of a sort for the murders he had committed. The details of his end, the sources report variously, but the outcome they confirm. The conspirator who had killed a king died himself before achieving the purposes that regicide had been meant to serve. The throne that he had emptied through murder was filled not by himself, but by the young man whose manipulation he had thought would serve his interests. Artaxerxes I ascended to kingship through circumstances whose violence marked his reign's beginning, with shadows that ceremonial magnificence could not entirely dispel. The son who had survived conspiracy that killed his father and brother took up responsibilities whose weight his youth had not prepared him to bear. The empire that Cyrus had founded and Darius had expanded and Xerxes had maintained now passed to a fourth generation, whose tenure would test whether the Achaemenid achievement could survive the trauma that succession had involved. The reign that followed would extend for over 40 years, its length exceeding both his father's and his grandfather's, its character shaped by lessons that the circumstances of accession had taught. Artaxerxes governed with caution that his introduction to power had encouraged, his policies emphasizing stability over the ambitions that had cost his father's predecessor satisfaction, and his father his life. The empire continued functioning with the efficiency that its administrative systems provided, the shock of palace violence absorbed by structures whose resilience proved greater than the individuals whose deaths had tested it. The assessment of Xerxes that history would render began forming even before his death in characterizations that Greek observers had already composed. Aeschylus's tragedy, The Persians, performed in Athens only 8 years after Salamis, presented the king, whose forces had burned that city to Athenian audiences, as a figure of hubris whose overreaching ambition had met the defeat that such excess inevitably attracted. The play's Persian setting and Persian characters permitted Greek exploration of themes that applied to their own situation. The foreign king, whose pride brought disaster serving as mirror for reflections on the dangers that success might encourage. The Greek portrayal that emerged from such cultural productions emphasized the expedition's failure while largely ignoring the reign's other dimensions. The builder of Persepolis, the administrator of the world's largest empire, the patron of religious and cultural development. These aspects of Xerxes interested Greek observers far less than the campaign, whose outcome their ancestors had determined. The king, who had accomplished much beyond the Greek adventure, became in Greek memory, primarily, the king who had failed in that adventure, his reputation frozen in the moment of defeat that Salamis represented. Persian memory preserved different emphases, whose traces survive in inscriptions that Xerxes himself had composed, and monuments whose imagery his reign had shaped. The king presented himself as servant of Ahura Mazda, maintainer of truth against falsehood. builder of structures whose beauty honored divine majesty. The military campaigns that Greek sources foregrounded appeared in Persian accounts as elements within larger patterns of royal achievement that construction and administration represented more fully. The Xerxes of Persian self-representation differed markedly from the Xerxes of Greek dramatic imagination. Modern historical assessment has attempted to integrate these divergent portrayals into understanding that acknowledges complexity that partisan sources obscured. The reign that Greek tradition reduced to failed invasion actually encompassed achievements whose significance comparison with predecessors and successors confirms. The building programs that transformed Persepolis into the ceremonial center, whose ruins still impress visitors, demonstrated vision and resources whose combination few rulers have matched. The administration that maintained imperial function across territories spanning 3 continents represented organizational accomplishment whose scale demands respect regardless of military disappointments. The Greek campaign itself has received reconsideration that contextualizes its significance within the larger patterns of Achaemenid history. The failure to conquer Greece, while consequential for Greek development and Mediterranean history, affected Persia's core territories minimally. The empire that Xerxes ruled before the campaign remained essentially the empire he ruled after it, its wealth and power undiminished by setbacks that occurred at its western margins. The resources expended on the expedition, while enormous by any standard, represented fractions of what the empire's annual revenues provided. Persian subjects in Susa and Babylon and Persepolis experienced no change in their circumstances that Salamis had caused. The monuments that Xerxes raised continued standing through centuries that saw the Achaemenid dynasty itself pass into history. Alexander's conquest brought the empire's end in 330 BC. The Macedonians' forces capturing Persepolis and burning the palace complex, whose destruction eliminated much of what Xerxes and his predecessors had created. The flames that consumed the wooden elements left stone structures damaged but not destroyed, their survival ensuring that later ages would have evidence of what Achaemenid patronage had produced. The terraces, whose reliefs depicted tribute-bearers from every corner of the empire, continued displaying their carved processions to audiences whose distance from Xerxes' lifetime exceeded anything his artists could have imagined. The ruins that travelers encountered in subsequent centuries preserved fragments of magnificence whose original totality required imagination to reconstruct. The columns that still stood amid fallen companions suggested the forests of stone that had once filled the great halls. The reliefs whose colors had faded and whose surfaces had weathered retained enough detail to convey the skill that their creation had required. The inscriptions whose languages had become unreadable by populations that had lost the knowledge their ancestors possessed waited for decipherment that modern scholarship would eventually provide. The rediscovery of Achaemenid civilization through archaeological investigation and textual analysis has restored Xerxes to historical understanding that Greek sources alone could not provide. The Persian perspective that inscriptions preserve, the material culture that excavation reveals, the administrative records that chance has saved. These sources enable reconstruction of a reign whose dimensions Greek hostility had distorted. The king who emerges from such reconstruction proves more interesting than the caricature that Greek drama had presented. His achievements and failures both appearing in proportions that partisan accounts had skewed. The mountains that rise behind Persepolis still catch the snows that winter brings to the Persian highlands, their white peaks gleaming against skies whose blue remains as vivid as when Xerxes watched the same scene from terraces his workers had constructed. The plateau where the empire's ceremonial heart once beat extends toward horizons that encompass landscapes essentially unchanged from what Achaemenid eyes observed 25 centuries ago. The continuities that connect present to past make possible a kind of communion with those who walked these grounds when the empire they served spanned the known world. The sunlight that falls across Persepolis in the hours before sunset transforms the stone into colors that shift through golds and roses as the sun descends toward mountains whose silhouettes frame the western sky. The shadows lengthen across terraces, whose stairs were climbed by delegations from every corner of an empire, whose diversity the reliefs still depict. The silence that now fills spaces once crowded with petitioners and guards and administrators offers opportunity for reflection that the business of empire would never have permitted. Xerxes built for eternity, and eternity has partially honored that ambition. The ruins that survive testify to vision whose scale matched the empire it expressed. The inscriptions that remain legible announce achievements that their author wished posterity to remember. The reliefs that wind and sand have not entirely erased preserve images of a world order that Achaemenid power maintained across generations of rule. The king who failed to conquer Greece succeeded in creating monuments that Greeks themselves would eventually marvel at, when Alexander's conquest brought them to territories their ancestors had never seen. The empire carved in stone has outlasted the empire carved from peoples and territories whose submission Persian arms had achieved. The administrative systems that governed satrapies from Egypt to Bactria have vanished into the past that all human arrangements eventually become. The armies that crossed the Hellespont and the fleets that filled the straits of Salamis have dissolved into the historical record that preserves their memory without preserving their substance. But the terraces of Persepolis remain, their stones bearing witness to what ambition, supported by resources and executed with skill, could accomplish in an age when empires rose and fell, but building endured. The quiet that settles over these ruins as evening approaches carries resonances that imagination can populate with the sounds of vanished activity. The footsteps of attendants, the murmur of petitioners, the commands of officials, the rituals of priests, all once filled these spaces with the noise of life that power had gathered and purpose had organized. Xerxes walked here, planned here, built here, and the evidence of that presence surrounds visitors whose distance from his time exceeds what his imagination could have compassed. The stars that emerge as darkness claims the highland sky include the same points of light that Persian astronomers tracked when Xerxes ruled and Babylon still remembered its ancient glory. The constellations wheel through their eternal courses, indifferent to the ambitions and disappointments that mortals experience beneath their distant fires. The king who bridged the Hellespont and burned Athens, who built Persepolis and died by servants' hands, has become part of the past that such nights encourage contemplation of, a figure whose complexity resists the simplifications that time encourages, whose achievements and failures both deserve the acknowledgement that honest history provides. The empire of empires has passed, but the stones remain. The King of Kings has fallen, but his monuments endure. The quiet conqueror who shaped one of history's most consequential reigns rests now in whatever peace the afterlife his religion promised has provided. The story he wrote in campaigns and constructions continues being told by ruins, whose silence speaks more eloquently than the inscriptions whose boasts time has rendered partly illegible. Xerxes built for eternity, and eternity, in its partial and ruined way, remembers.